12 Bombing. Author, Wild Wolverine. Lieutenant Issa, who was in charge of the attack, lowered his head and pressed a few times on the front HDD to connect the predetermined path points in series. It can be seen that the entire attack was carried out along a ravine, and finally turned a corner on the edge of a big mountain. See the landing field at the bottom of the valley. The first attack will be carried out by him. In addition to the Blue Shield pod, his F-16 also carries TV-guided bombs. The difficulty of the attack is to find the target and fire the weapon in time. Because the valley is too narrow, the whole process is quite rushed for a single-seat fighter. If he fails to hit, the two Xiaolong fighters of 26 Squadron will launch a second attack with ordinary 500-pound bombs, of course with less chance of hitting the target. There are 5 minutes left. Remember my words, the night is your friend and your worst enemy. Colonel Sammy said, looking at the RWR display. The main radio thread has never appeared, which shows that the mission's first part of the part that is hidden and approached is not bad, and the Indians are not alert. For many years, relying on the cover of night and mountainous terrain to approach the enemy has been the main subject of the Pakistan Air Force's research, and in this regard, they are no less than any other professional air force in the world. Of course, like everything else, low altitude and night are sharp double-edged swords, and even with accurate GPS and inertial navigation equipment, such terrain-dependent missions are still very risky, so the compromise solution is attacking after dusk or just before dawn would also interfere with the night vision of thermal imaging, but after many rehearsals it was concluded that low-light mode could work. I have seen the mountain. I'm about to turn. Lieutenant Issa said and slowed down. At this time, the relative altitude measured by the radio was only 500 meters, which was only slightly higher than the mountain in front, the eastern one. The horizon has turned white, and visibility is much better. This is a dilemma, and although the low-altitude approach is very dangerous, the descent is still worth the risk of being detected by nearby low-altitude missile positions. Lieutenant Issa turned on the power of the Blue Shield pod, turned over the mountain, and immediately turned on the auto-level driving. His eyes had to temporarily leave the front, move to a CRT monitor below, and adjust the mode to low-light mode. This was a risky time, and conceivably, the Air Force did not dare to deploy the new two-seater F-16 of the 5th Squadron better suited for this mission, apparently for fear of losing the new aircraft. The aiming pod is just below the belly of the aircraft, and its orientation is consistent with the nose of the aircraft, so theoretically, the aircraft can be barely controlled by looking at this small screen. The lieutenant turned the magnification to 8 and immediately noticed that in the green background, there were the silhouettes of two side-by-side M17 helicopters, parked on the flat ground of the valley, still a few kilometers away. Not far behind was the cliff. This Indians the location is well chosen, creating a lot of difficulties for air strikes. If the action of pulling up after launching the missile is a little sluggish, it will knock down the mountain. He first turned on the power of the seeker of the AGM-65 missile according to the procedure. While the seeker was warming up, the captain manually turned on the laser rangefinder aiming at the pod and measured the slant range of the target, which was only 2.8 kilometers. After a while, the missile seeker has started to work. The captain switches the display to the missile seeker channel, so that he can see the field of view of the missile. The effect of low-light imaging is far less than that of the reconnaissance pod. The field of view of the missile it is much smaller than the reconnaissance pod and can only have a magnification of 2.5 times. Fortunately, the target is already very close. Lieutenant Issa aimed the cross in the missile's field of view at the first helicopter, and the prompt on the slant range of the target showed that it was only 1.9 kilometers away. Griffin 1, the target is locked, Issa said. It was a fleeting moment, and then the captain saw the muzzle of a 23mm anti-aircraft gun beside him turning towards him. No doubt the soldiers there had heard the aircraft approaching, but with such visibility they should have unable to target yourself. He raised his head slightly, his eyes returned to the front, and he checked the autopilot status on the HUD. He was still in a stable level flight. When he lowered his head again, the lock-on prompt flashed on the screen, and the distance to the target was about only 1,500 meters, which is close to the minimum range of this missile. He pressed the launch button, a flash of fire flashed from under the plane's wings, the missile flew to the target, the lieutenant pulled the plane sharply, and if he didn't go, he would hit the mountain in front. The soldiers on the ground looked at the tail flame from the afterburner, but the enemy still started shooting, and the tracers could be seen flying past the sides of the cockpit. Rapid increase. With an explosion, the firing on the ground stopped. Lieutenant Issa wanted to circle around to see the result, but the rising sun jumping over the horizon pierced his eyes, so he had to keep climbing, lest he swerved and knocked down the mountain. I saw 2 targets missing. The warhead was too weak, said Colonel Raisami on the radio. Attention Griffin 2, check below you, I see something behind you, Uhak said. Lieutenant Issa immediately made a roll, and he immediately saw a white track flying towards him through a large arc. It's SAM 7 and it follows you. Lieutenant Issa immediately pressed the nose down. He was still in afterburner flight. The missiles that followed were very close to him. This was just an anti-aircraft missile carried by infantry, but it was very concealed when firing. The downed pilot won't know it's behind the missile until it explodes. Lieutenant Issa pressed the button of the jamming tracer and fired 5 groups in a row. Then he barely made a turn at 800 km per hour and the missile was dazed and flew to the other side, but this time it really freaked out the lieutenant. Not every pilot will experience one in their lifetime missile chase. The lieutenant, his movements became a little stiff, and he could barely steer the F-16 awkwardly away from the field. Good light, Abbas, your second attack, Sami ordered, and his wingman immediately charged into the valley. For him, a conventional bomb attack was easy and a hit was difficult. The Xiaolong fighter dived and dropped 2 500-pound bombs. The impact point was very far from the remaining helicopters. Because of the fear of hitting the mountain in front, the pilot's nerves had to undergo a great test. Obviously, Abbas did not withstand such a test. Good job, I've through more partials, Colonel Sami said. Colonel, don't be too reluctant, I suggest that you plan to fly over the valley to carry out a horizontal bombardment. Major Uka, who served as cover, said. Horizontal bombing? Sounds like it's bombing the runway. But Colonel, the visibility now. Uhak continued to chatter, as if to say that the colonel was too old to see. Captain Griffin, at 3 o'clock on the right, a signal was detected, probably a MiG-21, at a distance of 17 kilometers. This was the sound of an early warning aircraft 150 kilometers away. Leave it to me. Colonel, you can just drop bombs. Very well, young people always pick up the latest bargains. Colonel, I'll always be near you at 2 o'clock. Colonel Sami began to enter the attack field. This area was narrow and short. Compared with the first and second attacks, the light was slightly better, but the surrounding Indian infantry were also more vigilant. The colonel turned over the mountain at a relative height of 700 meters, roughly flush with the surrounding hills, and then entered the standard visual bombardment phase, which is simply, dive, then drop bombs to disengage. This way compared to the original inertial bombing, the difference is not big, just with the help of the bullet point computer. The colonel pointed the sight at the Mi-17 helicopter sloping down, turned on the impact point calculation, took time to look around, and confirmed that there were no infrared missiles following. This is a breathless moment, the target is getting closer and closer, and the steep mountain next to the target is getting closer, and there is no doubt that most pilots will drop their bombs early. This is because other pilots will turn on the autopilot, but with the exception of Colonel Sami, the autopilot will avoid high-angle dives, which can improve the hit rate for aircraft without precision-guided bombs. The colonel soon found that the height of the approach was a little high, so he pressed the dive angle to 17 degrees, almost pointing to the ground. The slope and speed parameters calculated by the impact point changed, and then restarted. This is in a terrible situation. It seems that there is only one way to go around it. Griffin team, the MiG-29 is found in the south, and it may launch an R-77. The sound of the early warning aircraft sounded. Are these old F-16s going to work? The colonel thought, thinking it was necessary to have the number 2 hovering nearby to support the other 2 F-16Bs that lacked medium-range ammunition. Abbas, you join the Griffin team and turn on the fire control radar to monitor the south. Understood. The thunder and lightning rushed to the ground, but the procedure of calculating the consecutive impact points was not completed. The height has dropped sharply to 120 meters, and the Indian soldiers on the ground are clearly visible. They did not leave the wounded and fled, and some bravely still opened fire with small weapons. Obviously, this is a well-trained force. The colonel knows that in a second or two in the middle of the clock, if you get on yourself, you will hit the ground, and the computer must not be able to count on the continuous impact point. Almost. The colonel pressed the bomb button and pulled up the plane at the same time. When the plane finally raised its head, it almost wiped the rotor of the M17, and the bomb exploded immediately. The colonel could see the green hatch of a blown helicopter flying past, but luckily he didn't hit his own plane. He desperately pulled the plane up, and a few Indian soldiers stood on the hillside stunned. The colonel and these infantrymen glanced at each other until the entire burning valley was thrown behind him. Just as he was about to look back, a huge R-77 missile rushed out from the side of the mountain, flew past Colonel Sammy. It flew towards an F-16, and the colonel didn't have time to see whose plane it was. The F-16 had already exploded in the air. "Ah, we lost Issa," cried Major Ucka. "Tell me about it." "There are more than 4 MiG-29s ahead. There are more MiG-21s. Where did they come from?" "As you expected, from the east, in the direction of the sun." Abbas shouted.